Undoubtedly, this is the second revision session for A-level history. This session will follow on from my previous session on American foreign policy from 1890 to 1941. In this session, we will look at the impact of US involvement in the Second World War and the Cold War between 1941 and 1975. In the next two sessions, then Mr. Morell will move on to the civil rights movement. We will then do a live session where we will discuss anything we've already previously discussed with you and answer any questions you might have. So again, I'm going to go through how the exam looks and go through exam technique before I go through the important content. So this paper will have two questions. Section A will have a short period where you can decide one out of two questions, and section B will cover the 100 years. If section A is on civil rights, then section B will be on foreign policy. And the other way around as well, if section A is on foreign policy, section B will be on civil rights. So like the previous session, I'll give you possible questions you could be asked on this small time period. So possible questions on the impact of US involvement in the Second World War and the Cold War. You could be given a specific president and asked how successfully they met the challenges of the Cold War in the period from 1945 to 1975. Last year and before, they've asked to what extent was US policy towards communism in Asia in the years 1949 to 1975 a consistent failure. And obviously, if that comes up again, they'll just change the word in the question. And how successfully did American presidents meet the challenge of the Cold War in the period 1945 to 1975? Now, when answering these questions, it's important that you remain fully focused on the key concept. So this is the one I used with you last time. We're mainly isolationists. You'll be discussing that key concept throughout. If you were discussing how successfully American presidents met the challenge of the Cold War, you'd have to debate the success of those presidents. So I wouldn't expect you just to give reasons why each president was successful. You need to debate it. How successful? Extremely successful. Were they unsuccessful? Were there certain limitations with how they met the challenges? So that's crucial that you have that debate. Also, you must cover that time period set. It's important that you do know the presidents for a question like that. You must also use detailed historical knowledge to support your arguments. Like I've mentioned, you need to analyze and evaluate the key concept. Don't just give reasons why they were successful and then list them like a for and against response. You need to cover a range of perspectives. And you need to make sure you reach a supported judgment on the exact question. So in your conclusion, if you were answering how successfully did American presidents meet the challenge, I'd expect you to decide how successful you think they were, but also give a balanced response. Tie up all the arguments you've had throughout that essay. So this session then is going to focus on the impact of US involvement in the Second World War and the Cold War in the years 1941 to 75. We won't have a third session on this, but there will be resources available on that period from 75 to 90 on the WJEC website. Now, the key issues we're going to cover in this is Franklin D. Roosevelt and the entry into the Second World War. Remember, we looked at the Neutrality Acts and how he tried to stay out of foreign affairs in the 1930s. We then look at the US and the Second World War. We look at their involvement in Europe and in the Pacific. And then we'll look at the Cold War and relations with Soviet Union and China between 1945 to 1972, and then the Vietnam War and its impact. Now, it's important to point out with these sessions, especially with A-level, that we will not be able to cover every piece of content in this session. So make sure we use this alongside other column revision sessions, your wider reading and your class notes, as well as an excellent WJEC resource they've got on the website, which is up for the blended learning resources, but it covers the whole time period in a lot of detail. So the first part of the content then is Franklin D. Roosevelt and the entry into the Second World War. So in October 1937, he made his quarantine speech, where he suggested that countries like Nazi Germany, Mussolini's Italy, and Japan need to be quarantined. Now, he doesn't name them, but it's clear that he is hinting towards them. This is a sign that he is seeing these countries as a threat, and he wants the rest of the world to put pressure on these countries. In November 1939, he then signed another Neutrality Act, which allowed him to include munitions and weapons in the cash and carry scheme. So this cash and carry scheme would mean that as long as a country paid upfront and collected any resources themselves, they could have it. This would allow him then to provide support to Britain and France. He then had approval in May 1941 to introduce the Lend-Lease Act. So that meant that he would now be able to lend these resources and they wouldn't have to pay up front. So that shows that he's having a lot more involvement in what is happening in Europe. Then he met with Winston Churchill in 1941, where they outlined their plans for what they want in a world after the war. And this was the Atlantic Charter. Then in 1941, they actually then get involved directly with the Second World War after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, a US naval base. So after US declares war on Japan, Germany then declares war on the US. So they're now fully part of that war. So I've got 5 key questions about that first topic area. I'm going to give you a minute now to consider those questions, and then I'll go through the answers with you. So if you need any more time now, just pause the video, or if you need to, the resources will be up for you to go through the previous slide. So question 1 then, when did Roosevelt make his quarantine speech? He made this in October 1937. Which countries was Roosevelt referring to in his quarantine speech? So he was, even though he doesn't name them, he's clearly referring to Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and the Japanese Empire. What did the 1939 Neutrality Act allow Roosevelt to include in his cash and carry scheme? It allowed him to include munitions and weapons. What did the Atlantic Charter outline? It outlined Roosevelt's and Churchill's plan for the world after the war. And which event led to US entry to the Second World War? The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. So if there's anything you're unsure about in those, go back and have another look through and go through these questions again. So now I'm going to go through the US involvement in the Second World War. Okay, so they joined in 1941. Their main concern is the Pacific because of what Japan had done to the naval base in Pearl Harbor. However, Churchill convinces Roosevelt to support in Europe. He makes it clear that the defeat of the Nazis is crucial for them to win the Second World War. So the first US intervention in the war in Europe was the Operation Torch Landings in North Africa. This was followed by a large-scale assault on Sicily in July of 1943, and then the invasion of mainland Italy. Now, the US supplied weapons and food to Britain and the Soviet Union throughout this. So it was not just the manpower that was crucial, it was the economic power of the US. They also started a bombing campaign against Germany from 1943. So the British would bomb by night and the US would bomb by day. Then on the 6th of June 1944, you would have heard of this, the D-Day landings. So the invasion of Normandy to try and take it back from Germany. So they advanced through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. They did get stopped by a German offensive at the Battle of the Bulge. However, they did manage to cross the Rhine and enter Germany by March 1945. By the 8th of May then, the war was near enough over and Adolf Hitler committed suicide. So they're the important events in Europe. Remember, it's American foreign policy, so it's from that perspective. Think about the importance of their manpower, economic power, the D-Day landings. So again, just to recap what I've gone through there, have a minute now to go through those questions and make sure you understand US involvement in Europe during World War II. Right, again, so if you need a bit longer, pause the video, but I'll go through the answers now. So who convinced Roosevelt to support in Europe? That was Winston Churchill. He made it clear that his contribution against the Nazis was crucial. US supplied Britain and Soviet Union with what? With weapons and food. When did the Allied bombing campaign of Germany begin? That began in 1943. When did D-Day begin? That began on the 6th of June, 1944. D-Day began with the invasion of which German occupied area? That was Normandy. And when did Germany surrender? They surrendered on the 8th of May, 1945, after the suicide of Adolf Hitler. It's also important that you understand the US role in the Pacific. Obviously, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, they felt passionately about defeating the Japanese. So one of the turning points was the Battle of Midway. Now, this battle was midway between America and Japan in the Pacific. So that is why it was called the Battle of Midway. Now, this was a turnaround then. This is when they start to island hop towards Japan to take back territories seized by the Japanese. Now, casualties were high. The Japanese resisted until the end. You had kamikaze pilots. The US had to deal with tropical diseases, which led to a large number of deaths. The Japanese finally surrendered in August 1945 after atomic bombs destroyed the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Again, I want to look through these key questions to make sure you understand what I've just gone through there in the US involvement in the Pacific. So, key information for that topic area then. So, which battle in the Pacific was a turning point in the war against the Japanese? That was the Battle of Midway. When did the Japanese surrender? They surrendered in August 1945. And the atomic bombs destroyed which two Japanese cities? That was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So those atomic bombs were crucial in bringing the war in the Pacific to an end. So this next topic area then looks at the Cold War and relations with the Soviet Union and China between 1945 to 1972. And you've seen on those examples I've given you that they could ask you specifically about Asia. Okay, if they do, you've got China, Korea, and Vietnam. So there were clearly long-term issues between America and the Soviet Union. They had ideological differences. America was a capitalist country that feared communism. They've had those suspicions since the October Revolution in 1917. Now they meet at Yalta and they agree to divide Germany. The Soviet Union gives support for the US and Japan, but Poland is still an issue. Now in Potsdam in 1945, there's different people representing the countries. Now you have Truman instead of Roosevelt, and he takes a much more hardline attitude towards communism. He doesn't want to be seen as weak. So they do have disagreements over whether or not there should be elections in Eastern European countries. Obviously, Stalin didn't want that, because he felt that he would lose the grip that he had over these countries. And Truman was very suspicious of Stalin. Now, because of these suspicions, he introduced something called the Truman Doctrine, and that's the policy of containment, the policy to try and contain the spread of communism. And this will be a big part of the course now until 1990. Okay, it's seen as probably one of the biggest turning points in the 20th century. And the reason for this policy of containment was the belief in the domino theory. They believed that if one country fell to communism, the others would then follow. In order to stop the spread of communism in Europe, they introduced something called the Marshall Plan, and this would provide economic aid to countries in Europe. So another minute then to consider what was the Truman Doctrine, what was the domino theory, and what was the Marshall Plan. Right, so like I said, Truman Doctrine is an important, massive part of foreign policy in the second half of the 20th century. Truman Doctrine is the policy of containment, the policy that they will try and contain communism, so stop the spread of it. The domino theory is the belief that if one country falls to communism, others will then follow suit. And the Marshall Plan is that economic support that they will provide for countries in Europe to stop them falling to communism. So Berlin is a massive issue. So Germany is split between the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin is also split in the same way. However, it's inside the Soviet zone. So Stalin is not happy with having those countries in that area. So he wants to keep his sector of Germany economically weak, while the Allies, America, Britain, and France want to make sure that it recovers quickly to prevent a communist takeover. So they give Marshall aid to their areas, and obviously then the divide becomes bigger. East Berlin and East Germany is weak, whereas West Germany and West Berlin is much stronger. In March 1948, then, the US, British, and French sectors were merged. Now, Stalin was concerned about this. He felt that people would see that it was a much better life over there and leave this area. So in June 1948, he decides to blockade any links between West Berlin and West Germany. Now, he felt that that would force the US to pull out. Instead, Truman decides to fly in large quantities of supply into West Berlin. Now, obviously, if Stalin was to shoot down a plane, that would lead to a full-scale war. So that didn't happen. The blockade was in place for 10 months, and then Stalin decided to remove it. So this obviously was a success for Truman and America. Berlin continued to be a source of tension for a number of years, because that is where capitalism and communism met directly. So in order to stop those people leaving Eastern Europe through East Berlin and Berlin, then they decided to build a wall in 1961. Now this did slow down the flow of people. You did have people who managed to escape. However, it was a lot more difficult now. So again, have 1 minute to think about these questions, and then I'll run through the answers with you. So let's run through them then. So Berlin was in the zone of which country? So even though it was split up between France, Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, it was in the Soviet Union zone. What happened in March 1948? Britain, France, and America merged their zones. This concerned Stalin because he felt they were going to become too strong and people would want to leave the weaker eastern part of Germany. So in June 1948, Stalin decided to blockade the zone so they wouldn't be able to get resources into West Berlin. The US responded by flying in resources, so the Berlin airlift, and they did this for 10 months until Stalin removed the blockade. And the Berlin Wall was built in 1961 to stop people leaving Eastern Europe. So this still comes under the topic of the Cold War from 1945 to 72, but it's important to see after Truman how Eisenhower tried to ease tensions. He was successful in some instances by meeting with Khrushchev. However, it didn't end well. So he introduces something called the Eisenhower Doctrine, and that is to fund resistance to Soviet influence in the Middle East. They formed the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization with countries like Britain and France to protect against the spread of communism in Eastern Asia. And there is a sign that relations are getting better because there's much more communication between Eisenhower and Khrushchev than there was between Truman and Stalin. So Khrushchev actually went on a state visit to the US. So that shows that massive improvement. However, after they start to meet at superpower summits in the 1961 in Paris, Khrushchev ended up storming out because they had an argument over the U-2 spy plane that was flying over Russia. Now, Eisenhower denied it. However, the pilot, Gary Powers, was actually still alive. So it was clearly Americans were spying on Russia at this time. So relations deteriorate again between the Soviet Union and America. So again, think about these questions, and then I'll go through the answers with you. So the first question then, why did Eisenhower introduce the Eisenhower Doctrine? Well, the Eisenhower Doctrine was to fund resistance to Soviet influence in the Middle East. Why did he form the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization? It's very similar, to contain communism in Asia. What did Khrushchev do that suggests relations were improving? He went on a visit to the US. What led to deteriorating relations between Eisenhower and Khrushchev? It was the U-2 spy plane that was shot down over Russia. So another important event in the Cold War, possibly one of the most important, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, this incident was the closest they got to full-blown nuclear war. Okay, so in 1959, there was a revolution in Cuba. Remember, Cuba is very close to the United States, so this would concern them. Previously in the course, you would have seen how much trade they did with Cuba and what a crucial area they saw it, very economic and strategically important. So Fidel Castro takes over Cuba. Now that is a concern to America. So they helped exiles who'd left Cuba try to overthrow Castro and the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now this is a massive failure. This is JFK's first real event, first involvement in terms of the Cold War, and this is a failure for him. Now, they felt that Castro was going to be very unpopular. This wasn't the case. He was very popular, and there was no support for this invasion. Now, Castro turns to the Soviet Union for support. So, within a year, bases to launch Soviet missiles were built on Cuba. These were photographed by US spy planes, and they also had intelligence that Soviet ships were heading towards Cuba. So Kennedy meets with his advisors to decide how to proceed. Now, he has to be very careful. Can't look weak, but he can't escalate the situation. So he decides on a naval blockade of Cuba. And then if the Soviet ships go past that, they have permission then to fire. And that would lead to a full-blown war then. So luckily, Khrushchev does decide to stop. And this then didn't lead to that full-blown war. However, it showed that they were not willing to push to a full nuclear war. So this was the most tense it got, and this was an important moment in the Cold War. Things did start to calm down after that. So in 1963, the Test Ban Treaty was signed. So this meant that it was unlikely they were going to develop new nuclear weapons at a quick rate. There was a direct hotline between the Kremlin and the White House, so there'd be more direct communication in future. So this meant that they tried now to avoid moments like this again. It got very heated at this point. So here's some key questions again. I'll give you a minute to think about them before we go through them. So what happened in Cuba in 1959? There was a communist revolution and Fidel Castro took over. Remember, it's very close to America, so this would have concerned them. What did the CIA wrongly assume about Castro? They thought he was unpopular. This was wrong. There was no popular support for a Bay of Pigs invasion. And this Cuban Missile Crisis was significant because of how close they got to full-blown war. This now meant that they tried to avoid that happening again. So the Test Ban Treaty slowed down the development of new nuclear weapons. They also set up a hotline between the Soviet Union and the United States, so they could sort things out quickly and directly from now on. So relations with China also deteriorate during this period because there is a communist takeover in China, and they also become in direct conflict because of the Korean War. So China support the communists in North Korea, and America want to stop the spread of communism to the south. So they successfully stopped the spread of communism by pushing the communists out of South Korea back to the north. However, General MacArthur decided to invade North Korea, ignoring the orders. So this isn't containment, this is actually pushing it back. But a ceasefire is agreed in 1953 after a stalemate for a few years, and this conflict is then ended. Now, these are the tensions between China in the earlier years. And again, have a minute to think about these questions. So why did relations between US and China deteriorate? And why did the US intervene in Korea? So first one then, why did relations between US and China deteriorate? Because they become a communist country in 1949. And obviously we know from the Truman Doctrine that America want to stop the spread of communism. And there's this fear of communism. Why did the US intervene in Korea? Because they wanted to stop the spread of communism from North Korea to South Korea. So the last topic then is on the Vietnam War. And again, the reason they get involved is because of this fear of the spread of communism and the belief in the domino theory. So Vietnam had been under French control. Now, they lost that control. But in the 1954 Geneva Agreement, Vietnam was divided into two. North Vietnam would be run by Ho Chi Minh, a communist leader, and South Vietnam would be led by a pro-US leader, Diem. Now, the US knew that if there were elections in the South, then communists would win. So they discouraged those. But they were backing a very corrupt, unpopular leader. So the Viet Cong were fighting for Vietnamese reunification. And from 1959, they start their campaign to try and reunite North and South Vietnam under a communist regime. So for a number of years, the US have been sending money, weapons, and advisors to support the South Vietnamese government. They also took people from their farms into strategic hamlets where they would be protected by American soldiers, which they didn't really want. Okay, this made them hate the government even more. Now, the US didn't realize how unpopular Diem was in the South. Okay, very corrupt government. It was not well run, and it looked like communism was better in the North than being led by Diem's government in the South. So he was assassinated in November 1963, and this led to instability in the South. Now, there are two incidents in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, which then led to US involvement. And now they justified full US military involvement in Vietnam. So with President Johnson, then it escalated this situation. Rather than providing money, weapons, and advisors, they now had men down in Vietnam. So a quick key question then, why did the US intervene in Vietnam? So the US intervened in Vietnam because, again, of this belief in the domino theory, the belief that communism is spreading. They wanted to stop the spread of communism from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. And the idea was that if they provide money and support, that would happen. But they didn't realize how unpopular the South Vietnamese leader Diem actually was. So they used two incidents at the Gulf of Tonkin as an excuse to become more involved in South Vietnam. So these are some of the strategies used by America. So they'd go on search and destroy missions to places suspected of being used as hiding places by the Viet Cong. Helicopters would fly US troops in, who would then often be required to burn villages to the ground to make sure they couldn't be used by the Viet Cong. Now, obviously, it's not only ineffective because they don't know if they've taken out any Viet Cong, it also meant that local people hated the Americans and actually started supporting the communists even more. Okay, they felt like they were the South Vietnamese people wanted them there. They were incorrect. Another strategy they used was Operation Rolling Thunder. So to stop supply lines coming into South Vietnam, they tried to carpet bomb these large areas. Again, that was unsuccessful. Supplies were still successfully transported in. They also used chemical weapons to destroy jungle cover and expose Viet Cong supporters. Again, it was civilians that were mainly impacted by this. So again, a very unsuccessful strategy. So 1 minute to think about this question. What strategies were used by the US in Vietnam? So all strategies then used by the US in Vietnam were ineffective. You got search and destroy, which lost them support and also didn't take out the Viet Cong as they suspected. The use of chemical weapons had more of an impact on civilians than the Viet Cong. And Operation Rolling Thunder didn't stop supplies coming into South Vietnam for the Viet Cong. So the last aspect of this then is their withdrawal. Okay, clearly this war is not going well for the US based on their strategies. They're losing support at home with stories like the My Lai massacre of atrocities committed by the American soldiers. And the US underestimated the strength and appeal of the Viet Cong. Now, they used effective guerrilla campaign, booby traps attacking at night, acts of sabotage. They knew the area well. They had their underground tunnels, and they were a lot more effective at fighting in that sort of area than the American soldiers. Now, they also were inspired by communism, so they had a lot more to fight for. It was their country. They were more committed and determined than the US troops. A large number of troops didn't want to be there. Now, in the end, the war cost a massive amount, $168 billion, 58,000 dead and 150,000 wounded. Back home in the US, there was a lot of anti-war protests and disagreement with what was happening. And this is the first proper televised war. So people actually saw what went on in this type of war and conflict. Now, Johnson didn't stand for president again, and Richard Nixon promised to end the war. Now, they did withdraw by 1975. They did try to provide support to South Vietnam. However, the army of North Vietnam had completely overrun the South, and it was now a united communist country. Laos and Cambodia then fell. So this does suggest that there's some truth in the domino theory. Now, this was humiliating for the US. They didn't expect anything like this to happen, but they had clearly lost this war. So final key question then, why did the US fail in Vietnam? So if you're thinking about this question, you need to think about US strategies, the ineffectiveness of those, the effectiveness of Viet Cong strategies, and also what the people of South Vietnam wanted. With the American strategies, they only started to hate them more. Okay, they weren't wanted by the South Vietnamese people. So they were fighting on behalf of the people who didn't want them there. Okay, so that's an important thing to consider if you think about that. And you'll notice when one of the questions was, were the US policy a consistent failure towards Asia? And your main argument here would be, yes, it was. However, still, you could find some arguments that it wasn't. That's your debate. Okay, it's crucial that you do consider a range of perspectives when addressing these questions. If there's anything I covered in today's session that you're unsure about, in the live session, I'll be going through foreign policy in the first 20 minutes, and Mr. Morell will go through what he's covered in his civil rights sessions. Thank you for attending the session, and I look forward to seeing you in the live session.